Well, good evening, everyone, and thanks for coming. So yeah, I'm the publisher of Safe Haven Books and the publisher of London Street Trees. And I thought I'd just begin very quickly by telling you about how this book came about in the first place and why here in 2020 we're doing a completely new edition. So I live in Limehouse in Docklands, and this book came about several years ago now. I live in Limehouse in London's Docklands on Narrow Street, which some of you will know by the historic Grapes pub owned by Ian McKellen. And I was trying to think about how the idea for this book first came about. And I think it was actually going to or coming from the Grapes several years ago, and just noticing the other side of the road in Narrow Street, these extraordinary trees. I could see they weren't London plane trees, which hitherto I'd figured were what you got planted on London streets. But these trees were nothing like that. They had leaves the size of dinner plates, and it must have been summer at the time, these extraordinary festoons of white blossoms. So what on earth were they? And I guess also, how did they come to be there? And who put them there? So my first instinct in these cases is to think, well, I'd better read a book about this. And of course, when I looked, a book didn't exist. And the nice thing about being a book publisher is that when there's a book you want to read and you discover it doesn't exist, you commission it. There was a guide to the street trees of San Francisco, but that wasn't much use for Narrow Street. So then Paul and I got together, and the upshot was in 2017, almost exactly 3 years ago, the first edition of this book, London Street Trees. And when I first had the idea for the book, back then I had no idea that the book we'd have ended up publishing 3 years later, in 2017, would show that there were, I think it was 300 different kinds of tree to be found on London streets, all the different species and cultivars, which was amazing enough. So the book came out. One kind of wonders when you do a new book how it's going to do, but as soon as it came out in 2017, people just got the idea. And 3 sold out printings later, and 3 years later, in 2020, it seemed like the time to do a completely new edition. And the main reason for that was that in those intervening 3 years, all London's tree officers that the boroughs employ to plant trees, and also a lot of neighbourhood groups around London, they hadn't stopped planting trees, thousands more trees on London streets, and even more remarkable and exotic species. So the new edition we're doing, it is very much a new book. It's bigger, it has more trees in, it has new features, it has all new pictures, and it's now about a London in which there are over 400 different kinds of tree to be found on London streets. And you'll hear about those in a very little while from Paul. Now, of course, this is a very strange and unparalleled time at the moment. But one thing about the lockdown coming as it has at this time of year is that it's coincided with that fantastic time of the year when suddenly nature gets going again, and all the trees spring into leaf, like something almost being said, as Philip Larkin put it. A really wonderful time of year. And it's also the case that although we're all virtually under house arrest, the one thing we can do, the one thing we're allowed to do, is go out for an hour's exercise every day, as long as it's local. And therefore, the nearest and most continuous interaction that we can have with the natural world is, quite simply, with all the trees along our streets. And an amazing sight it is. You know, it is nothing less than an urban forest we can find ourselves walking around on our daily exercise, an urban arboretum even. So that's why we've done a new edition of this book, because London is a very, very different place even than it was 3 years ago. So thank you for coming, and I'll now hand you over to Paul to tell you more about the kind of trees on London streets.
Great. Well, thank you, Graham. And I thought I'd put a couple of copies of got the new book here, and you can see the new book behind the old book, so you can see just how much bigger it is. So excuse my virtual background there, but it's a bigger book, more pages, and all the things which Graham mentioned as well. I was noticing as Graham was talking there that Nicola from Toronto has joined, and I was thinking that's fantastic to have people joining from all over the world. And I was just wondering whether there's other people from other parts of the world other than London. So if anybody's not from London, could you just type into the chat where you come from? And I think that would be really interesting for everybody to know, to see whether there's anybody else that's joined from around the world. Thank you for joining this as well from what must be lunchtime where you are. So I'm going to get a presentation together, and I'm going to share my screen with you. And I see there's people from Oxford, Scotland, Cheltenham, Edinburgh. This is fantastic. So brilliant. So I hope that you've got some questions about London street trees when we come to the end as well. Okay. So coming up on your screen now will be the presentation. So hopefully you're in speaker view and you get one big image on your screen, as opposed to gallery view, where you get all the faces of everybody else on the meeting as well. So welcome to the presentation. This should take about half an hour. If I'm going a bit slow, wave your hands around and I'll speed up. We'll start with this quote. So when I was researching this book way back in about 2016, I suppose, I came across a book called London Trees by A.D. Webster that was written in 1920. And he wrote this, that essentially London street trees were very boring. There was virtually no diversity. And he thought that 60% of the trees were plane trees. And since then, of course, it's got incredibly diverse. As Graham mentioned, there are now about 400 different species and cultivars on the streets of London. And I think plane trees account for just 3% of the species that you'll find, or the trees that you'll find. And that doesn't necessarily mean that we've lost trees. It just means that there are many, many, many more trees of a great many different varieties on the streets. So I think that we'll go through some of those more unusual species. And I'd just like to mention that my favourite part of London, of course, for street trees is Hackney, where Graham mentioned the urban arboretum. And in the book, I describe Hackney as an urban arboretum. And in Hackney alone, you can find 350 different species and cultivars. And around every corner, almost, you come across some fascinating trees. So we're going to fast forward to the 1960s. And this was from a history of the borough of Camberwell. He was talking, Harold Dios was talking about the Victorian habit of planting street trees, and these were the species that were recommended. So there was this idea that if you lived in the wealthier parts, you had larger trees and smaller trees in the less wealthy parts, and then if your street was so poor, you didn't have any trees at all. And now I think that many, many streets in London have street trees. There are probably many more streets with street trees than without. Those street trees are, as I say, hugely diverse, and the number of street trees is growing all the time. In fact, we reckon there's about 900,000 street trees in London out of a total population of 8.5 million. So they're a significant part of the canopy of London. So some of the species which are in the new edition of the book, I'll go through some of these. So first of all, this one was got a mention in the first edition, but it gets a whole page, a whole spread of its own in this one. And this is, of course, I'm sure you all recognise it, the Pineapple Guava, or the Acacelloiana. It's a very unusual tree, and there aren't very many of them about. They're mostly in Hackney, although I have seen them elsewhere as well. In fact, I live in Islington, and there's one round the corner from me. It's called the Pineapple Guava because it produces guava-shaped fruits, and it's related to the guava, and the flowers are also edible, and the flowers taste of pineapple. The fruits are also called feoa, and I've actually discovered them in a local greengrocer around the corner from where we live in Finsbury Park that sells them. So we bought some and tasted them, and they were nothing to write home about, I have to say. Maybe it's because they'd spent a lot of time on a plane to get here, but I don't know. Anyway, it's a really interesting tree to find. It has these very striking exotic blooms. Another species which has arrived on the streets of London in the intervening 3 years between the first edition and the second edition is Hibiscus. It was present when the first edition was printed, but this again has a whole section of its own. So Hibiscus is a very glamorous tree when it's in flower. It doesn't look that amazing when it's not in flower. It has these really striking flowers which flower in high summer. And this one is on the appropriately named Garden Walk in Shoreditch, which is entirely lined with hibiscus. And the thing about hibiscus is they have flowers a bit like a rose, where each, you can get lots of different cultivars. So each flower is quite different. So you can get white ones and pink ones and really deep magenta ones, and then ones with red centers and ones which are pure white, and you can get double flowers and single flowers. So there's quite a lot of variety in this species. And if ever you go down Garden Walk in high summer, you'll be really struck by this really glamorous street full of hibiscus. So this is a species which I think we'll see more of. It's certainly one that I've seen popping up around town. I've seen them in Hernhill, I've seen them in Limehouse actually, and in Kingston, in the town centre of Kingston upon Thames. There's a whole bunch of them as well. Next up is another one which I've seen in one or two places. In Lambeth, I've seen them in Camden and in Hackney, of course. And this is Clerodendrum trichotomum, which is also the glory bower. And it has a really fantastic aromatic flowers. But what I call it in the book, because it has several common names, and the one which appealed to me the most is the peanut butter tree, which is a great name. And it took me a while to really understand why it was given this name, the peanut butter tree. And it's nothing to do with the flowers, which are very, very aromatic, and they're quite striking. But it's actually, if you crush the leaves, they have a smell which is absolutely peanut butter. It's incredible. So don't go and vandalize them all, but when you do see one of these, slightly rip the leaf and you can just smell this amazing peanut butter scent. And that's something that happens at high summer when it's flowering as well. So you want to get close to it to smell those blossoms too. A striking tree, and another one which I'm sure we're going to see more of. Another one which made the grade this time, and this is a spread from the book, which looks quite different as well. It's got a new design. It's a new format. There's more room for words. So I had to write quite a lot of extra wordage for this, and it's got new photographs throughout as well. There are some of the original ones, but wherever possible, where the pictures were, I've got newer, more exciting pictures. And this is a species that wasn't in the first edition. It's a very common garden species, the cabbage palm. But Graham told me that he'd seen these on the street in Woolwich. And so I trekked down to Woolwich to go and have a look at them. And sure enough, here they are on the street in Woolwich. An unusual species to see as a street tree. Seen them in Cornwall, but never in London. So another fascinating tree to look out for. Some other things that have changed since the first edition. In the first edition, I reported that pine trees were very, very rare in London as street trees, and indeed they are pretty uncommon. There were a few outlying plantings of them. I came across them in Camden Town, some in Hackney, inevitably. But actually, you could probably count the number of pine trees on the fingers of both hands when back in 2017. But now, pine trees are beginning to pop up elsewhere. And in the intervening time, I discovered these ones at the Elephant and Castle. I've seen a lot more being planted in Hackney. I've seen some in Islington. And I think we're going to see more pine trees as well. Pine trees, of course, being evergreen, provide interest all year round, and they provide those crucial ecosystem services as well to clean the air and oxygenate the air. So there's a lot of benefits for having them. You might not want one outside your window during the winter, though. It might just be a little dark. So there are probably good reasons why evergreen trees aren't as common in some places, particularly more residential areas. Another thing that happened since the first edition was published was Sheffield. So there's a feature in the book about Sheffield, and you may or may not be aware of what happened in Sheffield. So it's worth recounting. It's a cautionary tale, I think, something that we should be aware of in London. And I think it's something which people will think twice about how we manage trees and how people feel about their street trees. So back in, I think it was 2018, Sheffield City Council employed a private contractor to manage their streets. And that included looking after the street trees that line the streets of Sheffield, which is actually one of the greenest cities in the UK. And this company, Amy PLC, decided that in order to manage these very mature and attractive canopy that was found all over the city, that maybe one of the easy ways to do that was to remove the big trees and plant small trees. So they started doing that, and it became apparent that within the city of Sheffield, there are 36,000 street trees, and they were going to remove 18,000 of them and replace them with new, younger trees. And some of these trees were over a century old. And in some parts of Sheffield, and I was lucky enough to go up to Sheffield I think it was at the end of 2018 for the Sheffield Street Tree Festival. And I took this photograph of the Chelsea Road Elm, which features in the book, not the same photograph, but it's a very rare Huntingdon elm that survived Dutch elm disease. And this became the focus for a lot of the protests in Sheffield. And at the festival, we all gathered around this tree. A local choir sang a song composed by Robert Macfarlane, no less. And we were sort of given this sense that the citizens of Sheffield cared very deeply about the trees on their streets and what was happening to them, and how unaccountable the city council was for their actions and how they were trying to sort of point out that this was a benefit to them. I'm sure that there were costs associated with it in terms of saving money, but eventually the council realized that this was an incredibly unpopular thing and stood down from what they were doing, but not before quite a lot of trees were lost, including whole avenues of lime trees. And this is an image that one of the protesters from Sheffield gave me of a lime tree avenue that was pretty much destroyed. And during that process, the police were involved. They had to have huge amounts of security. The whole streets were cordoned off. The people who were lopping the trees came at them in the first thing in the morning, and the protesters were playing catch up to get around there. There was a media campaign that even got into places like the New York Times, and eventually it's now officially on hold. We're hoping that that means it's not going to happen any more of this felling. But it also proves that people's voices can be heard, and I'm sure that many councils have looked at the example of Sheffield and thought, this is something which we don't want to repeat. I'm sure this would not happen in London anyway, because I'm sure our councils are much more sensible to the notion of the environmental benefits that trees provide. But something to keep an eye on. Another thing which has happened since the first edition is how other organisations have got involved in tree planting. And in the book, there's a feature about that and who plants trees in London, including one of the things I focused on is the group Street Trees for Living in Lewisham. And I think I saw in the chat that one or two people from that organisation have joined this meeting. So thank you, Xanthi, for coming, and Dom, if you're here as well, and anybody else from Street Trees for Living. And Street Trees for Living have started raising money. They operate in the borough of Lewisham. And this is a street in Lewisham, which I photographed in 2016, I think. It had no trees on it. And I showed it to Xanthi a year or so ago, and she said, we've planted trees on that street. And I think that what they're doing is a model for how citizens can get involved with planting trees in the future and how that might work in other parts of London. And this is another image of the borough of Lewisham. This is outside Brockley Station. And this is a tree that was planted by Street Trees for Living. It's a Persian silk tree, fantastic glamorous tree, which has amazing pink foliage. This one is very young, so it's got a relatively small amount of blossom on it, but the blossom is pink and looks like threads of silk. It has this very exotic looking leaf as well. And there's a bunch of them that have been planted outside Brockley Station, and it looks really fantastic. I hope that we're going to see more of this species around London. There certainly are other ones popping up in Southwark. I've seen them in Hackney and in various other places too. I think it's going to be a tree that we're going to see more of. A very glamorous tree. Maybe it's one to have occasionally, because I imagine that having whole streets of them, we might get bored of them. I don't know. But this is another page from the book which shows some of the volunteers from Street Trees for Living doing the work of planting trees on the streets of Lewisham, and one or two other people that are involved in that. So on the top right there is Greg, who's a tree officer in the borough of Lewisham. I don't know whether you're on the call, Greg, but Greg is someone that has been very helpful during this publication. So next up is a species which actually doesn't feature in the book. This is one which I've seen subsequently. It's a species which is very unusual. It's a chestnut-leaved holly. It's a tree which I wonder whether we're going to see more of. These ones seem to be doing quite well. Blackfriars. It's Ilex cross coeniana, I believe. It's not the same as our native holly, which is a tree which is not very suited to being on the streets. It's one that maybe we'll see more of. So maybe in a couple of years, there might be a third edition. You never know. But I think that's the thing about trees in London, is they're constantly, new species are appearing on our streets. And I think that inevitably a book about street trees is going to be, in some ways, slightly out of date almost as soon as it's published, if it's trying to show you all the different species which are going to be able to be found on the streets. Some things haven't changed, or rather they've remained as amazing as ever. And this is the street in Southwark. This is Herne Hill, very close to where Sue lives. Hello, Sue, I hope you're on the call. And it's a Yoshino Cherry Avenue, Winterbrook Road, which when I was researching the book originally in 2016, I was trying to find out what was the best cherry tree avenue in London. And of course, cherry tree avenues are, I suppose, a sort of staple of suburbia. And where I live in Islington, not far from Crouch End, there's a very good one, Cecil Park, which is planted with very blousy pink Kanzan, which is the classic and much planted pink cherry of suburbia. But Robin Cruikshank Hilton, who's a former councillor in Southwark, got in touch with me, and she told me about a street that she'd planted on Winterbrook Road, which is Herne Hill. And she said, I grew up in Washington, DC, and in Washington, DC, they had these wonderful Yoshino cherry avenues, and it was a species that she had hardly seen in London. And she managed to persuade the tree officers in Southwark that this would be a great tree to plant as an avenue. And this is now, I think, 10 years later, the trees are now really coming into their own. It's a street worth visiting in mid to late March to catch it in blossom, because these Yoshino cherries really are magnificent. And to see a whole avenue of them, it's a real spectacle. I lead a walk, or have done for the last 3 years, around Winterbrook Road and other parts of Herne Hill, looking at the street trees to coincide with the blossom. Sadly, this year we had to postpone it, but hopefully we'll be able to do that next March. So this is one thing which is just coming into its own, and something which I think is going to mature. And I wonder whether a trend is re-emerging of the idea of an avenue. It's something which we've sort of lost with the notion of planting a great diversity of trees. You'll walk down a street which might be architecturally the same or consistent, but will have a very different array of trees on it. So I think sometimes when you have an architecturally consistent street, it's worth having the same trees. I think there's a lot to be said for having different trees and a vast, diverse street tree flora to pick from, but maybe sometimes having a whole avenue can be really striking. Plane trees are still going strong after 150 years. You see no signs of them diminishing. This is Kennington Lane, one of my favourite areas of London to go and look at plane trees. Plane trees, of course, we'll see all over London. They were the tree which the Victorians first planted as street trees. They have survived pea supers, the Blitz, industrial pollution, and they're still going strong. There are pests and diseases lining up to get them, but fingers crossed they will remain. But something that I've managed to solve in this edition is the mystery of the Astronaut trees. Now, I don't know whether anybody has been down Kennington Lane, but it's really worth going down there. On the top deck of a 159 bus, for instance, look out at the plane trees at top deck height, and you will see these tags on, I think it's, I can't remember how many of them it is now, but at top deck height, tags of astronaut names are pinned to the trees. And this is something which I've known about for a long time. They've been there since the late 1990s. The tags are all the names of all the Apollo astronauts that have been into space. Some of them are missing. I think some of the trees have been lost. Maybe an Ocado van crashed into one. One or two might have succumbed for other reasons, but there are still quite a few left. And it's a mystery which has eluded people for a long time. There's been quite a lot of debate on Twitter about it. There were sort of theories about where they came from. And Michael Keane, who may or may not be on this call, but who's a local Green councillor in Lambeth, I believe, helped me out and discovered that the Interplanetary Society, who are based in nearby Walworth Road, actually put these on in the late 1990s, and they've been there ever since. And they're obviously being cared for by Lambeth Council, and it's a great thing to go and look at. One of the great mysteries of London street trees solved there for you. Right, so other things that have changed. Got some more walks in the book. So one of the popular things, or one of the things which people said when the book first came out was, we really love these walks. There were 4 walks in the book, north, south, east, west London. So we've added 2 more. We've got one in the city and one in the West End. This is the city one. Takes you around all the skyscrapers, so you get to look at the architecture of the city as well, and see some of the glamorous trees that have been planted around the city. So for instance, there's dawn redwoods around the Gherkin, and southern magnolias around the cheese grater, which is a species which we're beginning to see quite a lot of. It's an evergreen tree. It has those really magnificent white blossoms in high summer, which have a fantastic lemon scent to them. So that's a tree I think we're going to see more of as we, I suppose, move into maybe a warmer climate. And I think that's one of the things which the guys and girls who are planting trees in London, the street trees, are selecting species that were once considered quite exotic. And one of the things that we were going to do when the book was originally going to be published was we were going to add to that exoticism that we'll see on London streets. And with a bit of help from Rupert, who's Hackney's tree officer, Graham had been in touch with Rupert and said, wouldn't it be great if we could plant a tree to commemorate the a new edition? And Rupert said, that's a great idea. If you can get a tree for us, we can see what we can do. And so Graham very cleverly managed to find one of these, a lemon tree. And the lemon tree is still going to be planted. This is the lemon tree in its quarantine at the moment. It's in I guess a nursery somewhere in England, waiting for the day to come when it can be planted. Obviously, we've missed the planting season this year. The planting season is during the winter. So we may be able to plant it hopefully later this year, maybe in November. And so in a small way, this book is adding to the diverse and exotic flora of London street trees, with a lemon tree which will one day hopefully grace the streets of Shoreditch. So keep an eye on my blog. I shall be letting you know more about that, and hopefully that will be a public event. I'm hoping that some Hackney councillors may be involved in that as well. I think I might have Vincent on the call. Hello, Vincent, and hopefully we'll be able to tell you a bit more about that in the future. And so that's sort of, we're reaching the end of my presentation. So if you've got some questions, start thinking about them, and then we'll get on to those. think there's just a couple more slides to go. Oh, I think there's one missed out one. How do I go back? Oh, here it is. I couldn't resist this one. On my daily exercise, I've been walking around the streets, sometimes cycling a bit further afield, to see some particularly good street trees that I'd always like to go and see. And I went into the city the other day, which is an eerie place at the moment, but there's a really fantastic Judas tree on Alderman berry, and I had to go and have a look at it, and it is absolutely flowering at its peak. So if anybody lives in that part of the world, or is a short walk from it, or a easy cycle, I recommend going to see the Alderman berry Judas tree at the moment, which is absolutely festooned with the most fantastic blossom. I posted this on Twitter the other day, and the guy who looks after the trees in the city came back to me and said there's some thought that this might not actually be a European or Levantine Judas tree, Cursus silocastrum, but actually a very rare Chinese Judas tree, which would be a first for me as far as a street tree is concerned. So another one to add to the list of new species in London. So that's just about it. We can carry on the conversation if you like online on my website. I'm at the Street Tree on social media. I've got one more announcement to make. I'm going to stop my screen sharing now and back to me, and then I'm going to unmute you if you've got some questions in a minute. What I'd like to say is that, of course, normally at a book launch, we'd all be milling around drinking wine, and you would, of course, all be thinking about buying this fabulous book, of which there'd be a pile of next to the where the wine is kept. But today, obviously, we're still going to do something similar to that, and you can still buy the book. And I think that Catherine's going to put a link into the chat and a discount code, which Graham has set up on his website. So the book is for sale at a special discount of 10%. So if you want to buy it, follow that link, use the discount, and we'll there. I think there's the as close as we can get to a real live book launch. And of course, I've not had a single glass of wine either. So I think if we're going to get on to questions now, so if anybody has a question, I'm going to go to gallery view so I can see all your faces. And if someone's got a question, if you want to wave your hand frantically, I will try and get to you, and I will come and ask you to ask your question. I saw Jack there waving his hand, so I've unmuted you, Jack. Fire away.
Hi, Paul. Thanks very much for the great talk. I suppose the question I had is, if there was a species of tree that you haven't seen planted in London that you would like to see, have you got a particular species?
Oh, well, I suppose that's a good question. The one which I always I think would be great, there are in the book a few species which aren't in London yet that I kind of think we may see in the future, including the jacaranda, which I'm not sure our climate is quite ready for, although I have heard that there are rumours that we might see one soon. But a tree which is less glamorous, but one which I think we should see, is the true service tree, Sorbus domestica. It's a bit like a rowan, but much bigger and longer lived, and has edible fruit as well. So that's one I'd like to see. Okay, now Michelle.
Hi, thank you. That was such a great talk. It's less of a question and more of a shameless kind of work thing. But I just wanted to let you know, I work for the Friends of Tower Hamlets Cemetery Park in Tower Hamlets in London. And we are the largest urban woodland in London, and we're a designated nature reserve. We preserve the site for nature and heritage. But we've actually, through the community project that I'm managing, we're doing a lot of outreach work. And tree walks are the kind of one of the most popular events that we deliver. It's really amazing, and for us that have been kind of working in conservation for many years, it's been a real lovely experience discovering more of the street trees in Tower Hamlets. And I basically just wanted to say, if you have any chance to have a chat with me at some point, it'd be lovely to discuss how we might be able to do a little collaboration, or whether you'd like to come and see the trees around outside the walls of Tower Hamlets Cemetery Park. I'd really love that if you were interested.
Sure, well, that sounds great. Maybe if you drop me a message through my website, or via a DM on social media, I'm sure we could pick that up. That sounds good.
Thank you, Paul. Lovely.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to go to Nicola now.
Yeah. Oh, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hello, everybody from Toronto. It's so lovely to be here. I did have a question. At this point, you've done so much research, and you've got the second version of the book. But I was just wondering about how you managed to deal with all the tree ID that you do, especially because you're looking at cultivars and you're very specific. So, do you have any tips on resources that other people, apart from your book, would be very helpful? Like, do you get that information from the tree officers, or maps, or?
There's all sorts of sources, I suppose. So, I suppose what I've done is I spend a lot of time pounding the pavement and trying to work things out. And when Graham and I were first discussing the book back in, I guess it was 2015, I was thinking, oh, there's all these trees. I know some of them, and I didn't know a lot of them. So, for instance, where I live, we've got a Caucasian wingnut at the end of our road. And that was a tree which I had no idea what it was for a very long time. And so took me a long time to work that one out. And I think gradually as things have become, as I've got to know more about them, I begin to fit these things in. So every spring I try and learn another couple of cherry varieties, for instance. But there are things like, there are a few maps around. So the Mayor of London has released the map, the data from most of the boroughs. There's still one or two missing, including Hackney and Haringey and Brent. Get your data onto the Mayor, and we can see what all those great trees are. And that data is in the public domain, and there are some amazing things like treetalk.co.uk that I've been involved with, where we're mapping some of those trees. But then the tree officers are also really, really helpful. So I've done a few walks around parts of London with some of those. So Rupert in Hackney, for instance, has been brilliant. Oliver in Southwark's been great. One or two others, people in Westminster and some of the other boroughs have, and Islington as well, have been really, really helpful. I've met quite a few other tree officers through the London Tree Officers Association and various events. So it's a variety of sources. Not a quick answer, I'm afraid, Nicola.
Yeah. Oh, I didn't think it would be, but I was just curious because it is, it's sort of an ongoing process. It's something I'm always trying to figure things out myself with the street trees in my city. And I just was curious to see, I see that it's just as complicated possibly wherever you live. Really.
I'm sure it is. I'm sure.
So simple and so, right. Well, thank you so much. It was great to be here. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for coming from Toronto. Are there any more questions? Nick.
Hello, Paul.
Hi.
Really enjoyed the talk. You described what sounds like a bit of a boom in recent years in tree planting. Who gets the credit for that? Is that the mayor or is that individual councils?
Well, I think it's down to councils. I think the mayor has a limited amount and influence on it. And obviously there are policy things which the mayor can institute to encourage planting. I think that individual councils are the ones which have to find the budgets for those. And in some boroughs, those budgets are much better than in others. So, and for instance, in somewhere like Lewisham, I'm taking the example of street trees for living again, it's down to the residents that have done a lot of the work in getting the money together to pay for street trees, but in collaboration with the council, who will be looking after those once they've been planted. So yeah, there's been a lot of different motivations, but I think that increasingly people are really aware of the trees which are on their streets, and have certainly, since the publication of the first edition, and met loads of people who have been really interested in this topic, because I thought tree sort of interest was a lonely topic, that it was only me that was interested in it. But since then I've discovered there's been a load of interest. And I think, you know, in our current situation as well, with a lot of people spending time in the city, going out on walks with sometimes not a great deal to do, that noticing street trees, particularly in the spring, has been something which maybe many of us have done for the first time. So I think there's lots of motivations.
Thanks, Paul. Really enjoyed the talk.
Thank you. Rich.
G'day, Paul. Hey, everyone. Thanks for the talk. Great again. Awesome to hear the second edition's out. I had a question about you've got reference to the valuation and the value of trees in that first edition.
Yeah.
And it follows on, I guess, from the question just then as well, around councils making a concerted effort, riverside strategies existing as well, carbon being a big thing. But is there any sort of more thinking on the valuation of street trees now that we're in this more climate conscious world?
Yeah, well, that's a really good question. I think that the caveat value, which is the thing which is outlined in this book, which is a way of putting a financial value on trees, is perhaps a little problematic, because it allows trees to have a financial value on them, but it doesn't necessarily bring up sort of cultural value or any of these sort of less tangible valuations, which I think many people would think were very important to how you think about trees. And I don't think that we've got to a point where we've resolved that yet, but I think that will be something that will hopefully that conversation is going to continue. And I think the caveat valuation is a really good start. And obviously it works in certain situations. It didn't work particularly well in Sheffield, though, I have to say that.
Cool. Good to know we're speaking about it anyway. Thanks again.
Okay. Jeff.
I got
Sorry,
it.
Missed that.
Hi there. Got it. I come from Herne Hill, and I run a sort of tree warden group there, which is great. And I like the fact that you mentioned Herne Hill a few times in your talk. It's wonderful. There's something I wanted to ask you about street trees and about native street trees, which I've mentioned on Twitter before, and I think I had a reply from you about how they're kind of frowned upon as street trees, is the impression I get. I was delighted to see that Southwark in the last week or two, just around the corner from me, has planted a fastigiate English oak, which is terrific from my point of view, from the point of view of climate capture and carbon capture and biodiversity. And I wondered if you could share your views on natives.
Well, I guess that I think this is a sort of interesting debate about native versus non-native, something which comes up a lot. So native trees is a very limited number of native trees, and they're not very suitable, a lot of them, to actually surviving on what's a very non-native environment, the city street. So the actual climate that you find on city streets in London is very different to the natural environment in which our native trees live, which, you know, if you consider somewhere like Epping Forest, for instance, probably has a very different microclimate to the streets of Herne Hill. And there's also this thing called the urban heat island effect, which means that within the city, and particularly in the centre of the city, the temperature can be up to 10 degrees warmer, particularly at night, which means that more exotic species are more suitable to the actual man-made environment in which we're asking them to live. And I think that we have to recognise that the city is not a natural environment. And while native trees can provide a lot of benefits to other wildlife, I think there's also an argument to say that having non-native trees can provide an awful lot of aesthetic and botanical interest, which is also of great value to many people, and equally to wildlife. So behind me at my screen at the moment is a horse chestnut, and horse chestnut, of course, is not a native tree, but we regard it as a sort of almost honorary native tree.
Okay, that's a really good answer. Thank you very much.
Pleasure. Now I'm going to go to iPad. So who's iPad?
Oh, it must be me, Paul.
Yeah. Who's
yeah,
that?
It's me. Yeah, it's John.
Hi, John.
Hi there. Just going back to one of those previous notes about the boom in the tree planting. I was involved in a lot of street tree planting in the 90s and early 2000s. And one of the big organisations we got involved with was Trees for London.
Yeah.
Have you heard of them?
I haven't, no, but I know Trees for Cities.
Charity organisation that's changed its name to Trees for Cities.
Yeah.
Previously they were called Trees for London. And that was in the sort of the 90s and the early 2000s. And there's still the odd stake leaning against a tree that says Trees for London, because we used to spray each stake stencil so that everybody walking past knew where the tree came from, because the boroughs couldn't afford to put their own trees in, especially I think Mum was the city really. So I just really wondered if you'd heard of Trees for London in your...
Yeah, well, Trees for Cities actually, come across them a lot. In fact, the first edition features Harry, who used to work for Trees for Cities, now works for Hackney, who planted, who I went out on a maintenance walk with around Newham, because Trees for Cities had been asked to plant trees there, and I know that they've been planting trees in Ealing as well. So they're still involved in tree planting around London.
Yeah, they had an office in Kennington Park.
Yep, still there. Been there a few times.
There.
Yeah,
that's it.
Yeah.
Okay, now we were planting at least probably 300, at least 300 trees a year for them.
Well, yeah, that's pretty good. I'm sure that they're now planting even more. I know that this year they planted their millionth tree that they planted throughout their existence. So they have a really great track record.
All right, no, it's just interesting because we were involved with them right from the birth.
Yeah.
Of that charity.
Great. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Any more questions? Wave your hand. Oh, there was one. Someone was waving their hand there. Lost them. Liz.
Well, I'm not Liz. Liz is here.
Okay.
It's her computer we're using. Yeah. So I worked for a publisher in Cairo, in Egypt.
Wow.
And 40 years ago, we published a book called The Street Trees of Egypt, which went out of print about almost 10 years ago. And it was made entirely of hand-drawn images of the trees, yeah, and really quite kind of real piece of what you would call local publishing at the time. And we're asked quite regularly about, can you bring this book back into print, or is there something else? And we want to commission such a book. Probably be The Street Trees of Cairo actually this time. And so, given what you've been through, my question is a technical one. What is it in the photography of the trees that people most want to see? Or when they comment on it? Is it an identification thing? If we're going to go around Cairo and record the street trees, which are surprisingly a lot, what's the most important thing to capture in the pictures, do you think?
Well, I think that's a very subjective question. I suppose it depends what sort of book you'd want to publish, but I think personally, I feel like I wanted to photograph the trees within the city. So it was about the tree in situ. It wasn't necessarily a botanical record of the detail of the tree, because I think there's lots of, I mean, certainly in the UK, there's lots of books which you can get, which can guides to what a tree is and what it looks like, and you know how many stamens it has and that kind of stuff. I was more interested in seeing a tree within the context of the city and being able to recognise that this was London and have that familiarity of the city. So that would be what I would recommend. There are some other books of other cities. Graham mentioned the San Francisco one. There's a New York one, and I've also got this one, which is rather fab as well. Trees of Delhi, if anyone's got that.
Oh wow!
A great book, and there are. I think it's sort of looking at them from that point of view. And I guess as we've gone into a second edition, all I can say is that maybe that was the right approach, particularly, especially for our book.
Brilliant.
Yeah, I think I'll probably think, and Carol doesn't have, you know, parks and green spaces in the same way. So the book itself would definitely say where in some cases, this is the only place you can see this tree.
A tree.
But do you try and photograph them when they're in blossom? Presumably that's the
yeah, I mean, I would tend to go and, for instance, I remember when we were about to publish the first edition, which was in March, it was in 2017, and the publication date was May. And obviously there's quite a lot of lead time at printers. And I was really keen to get a picture of mimosa in blossom. And that year, mimosa was quite late flowering. And I was saying to Graham, we've got to get the mimosa. We've got to kind of wait to send it to the last possible moment. And this mimosa was really late to flower. And eventually I managed to get a picture of it in a fantastic tree in Pimlico that was in flower. And we got it in. But yes, I think that having the blossom is the key thing which people notice.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
Pleasure. Any more comments or questions? Oh, Catherine.
Question.
I can just relay some from the chat, but I think Harriet is one of those. So
okay, yeah.
Jack, well, let me just go through these, and people can ask them themselves if they want. Jack wants to know where the lemon is going to be planted. Well, that's a good question, and I can't give any more information on that just yet. You're going to have to wait and see, but I'm going to hand over to Graham before too long, and he may be able to add a bit more detail on that one. Okay, I mean, just Harriet wants to know, it feels as if London's doing a good job overall with its trees, especially some boroughs. Are there any other towns or cities in the UK that do a good job, and why? Yes, they're bound to be. There are, certainly. Ones that spring to mind are Brighton has fantastic elm collection. So Brighton is the home of the National Elm Collection, and the 17,000 elms on the streets of Brighton, which the City Council manages fantastically and really looks after them. They're elderly trees, most of them, survived Dutch elm disease. So there's a shout out for Brighton there. And other places, Manchester has Manchester City of Trees organisation, which is aiming to plant lots of trees there. Edinburgh is doing stuff with City of Trees initiative, which the City Council is doing. And I think that, you know, whenever I've been around the UK, I always like to look at trees, and I've seen them in all sorts of interesting places. We were in Leicester recently, and that was quite interesting. So yes, I think London is not necessarily the place to follow. I think every city or town does its own thing. There's a couple more questions in the chat. Helen wants to know how long most trees will live. And Xanthi's got a question for you, which I guess she can ask you directly about horse chestnut. I might unmute Xanthi, actually, if I may.
Hi everyone. Oops. thank you for mentioning street trees for living. That's really great and brilliant talk. I just want to know what kind of horse chestnuts you would recommend to plant that might be a bit resistant to disease.
Well, Indian horse chestnut would be the one. Aesculus indica, which flowers later than regular European horse chestnut and isn't susceptible to leaf miner attack. And they're actually a very lovely tree, I think.
Thank you.
Pleasure. Well, thank you for joining. And if you'd like to say anything about street trees for living, Xanthi, because Xanthi is the chair of Street Trees for Living, and what Xanthi and her team are doing in Lewisham, I think, is a exemplar for what might happen in other parts of the world, indeed.
Oh, thank you. That's terrific. Well, we're just tapping into the fact that so many people want to join in and plant trees, water trees, be involved with trees. So I would suggest anyone who's interested in how you get going to plant trees in your streets, have a look at our website and get in touch with us, and we can answer your questions, because it is quite a challenge to plant street trees, but lots are going in. And we're nothing like Trees for Cities, but because they're huge, but we are planting our 1000th tree this year, so we're very happy. And also we're going to have a very, I don't know if I'm allowed to say this. Am I allowed to say this, Paul?
Why not?
Okay, we're very, very excited because Paul is going to be our patron from tomorrow. Hooray! So that's our best.
I'm very excited as well.
Well, thank you. I'll mute myself now.
Okay, thank you. And there was a question from Helen about the age of a tree, which I will go back to. And that will be how long do street trees live? And generally street trees live a lot less long than they would otherwise. But it really depends on the species. And I think that trees which are particularly good at living long lives are plane trees. And a tree which doesn't live very long is the rowan. So the humble rowan will only last about 25 years. But usually, if you think of a tree being about 50 or 60 years old, a cherry tree might be about 40, but a plane tree could live for 150, or longer. So it really varies. Now, has Oscar got a question?
Yes, yes, he does. What's your favorite tree?
Oh, that's a very difficult question. I've got lots of favorite trees. I guess my favorite at the moment is the London plane tree. How about that? What's your favorite?
I don't really know. I think it's cherry blossom.
Good choice. Yeah.
I've seen a lot of those recently.
Thank you.
Paul.
Right. Catherine.
Oh, I was just waving at Oscar, sorry.
Oh. It's descending into that. We've all been drinking too much at the free bar that Graham has provided.
Paul, my name's not Harriet, it's Louis, that's Harriet. I was just going to ask, which trees can produce things that are edible? As a Yorkshireman, I'm always interested in free food.
Well, I suppose there's lots of trees which produce edible fruit. I couldn't possibly say that it's a good idea to eat the fruit off street trees, but if you were looking, you might look for something very exotic like the pineapple guava, which I mentioned. You can find crab apples, some cherry trees. I've seen, where I live in Islington, we get sand pears, which are Nashi pears, which you might have seen in supermarkets and stuff, which is an Asian pear variety that look like apples but are very edible. I've never tried one. I've seen a peach tree in near where I live, near Finsbury Park, and there is a persimmon in Stoke Newington, and pecans in Hackney as well. So
as well.
All sorts of things.
Go on. There she is.
Thank you.
Pleasure. Anne.
Hi. We've heard a lot about Hackney, and I was wondering, a couple of us were wondering, I think, from the chat there, why Hackney, what's special about Hackney, how they've managed to do such an amazing job.
That's a good question. I think I guess that the thing about Hackney is the transformation. I used to live in Hackney about 20 years ago, and it wasn't particularly well treed then. And in that, since the beginning of the 21st century, trees have really been planted there, and they've had a particularly sort of interesting tree officer who's called Rupert, that who's also a plantsman, I think, and he's really interested in planting a really unusual variety of trees. So when I was first researching this book, I didn't know Rupert, and I was wandering around the streets of Hackney and just thinking, I have no idea what that is. What is this? I've never seen one of these before, or I've only ever seen one of these in Kew Gardens before. So there were surprises which I found so fascinating, and that's what I think is so interesting about Hackney. Subsequently, I think the council's really got on board, and they are sort of putting funds into planting trees, and there are plans to increase the canopy in Hackney from, I think, about 25% canopy cover to 40%, planting 5,000 trees over the next few years. So I think they're the sort of antithesis of Sheffield in that sense. Right, I'm sort of conscious that we're maybe, Vincent is there, actually.
Yeah, hello, Paul, thank you. It's Rita, actually, but I'm speaking on Vincent's, hello, I'm speaking on Vincent's computer. It's really in respect to the last question, because I'm not a councillor in Hackney anymore, but I used to be, and it was at the time that we started this big tree programme. And it's true, I think the appointment of Rupert and giving Rupert his head was very important, but the political decision was giving him the money. So, you know, you do actually need the politicians to be behind it in a sense. So I would say that the political decision came transformed the public realm. So that was that. So, I mean, there was another question that was to do with whether or not it was the Mayor of London or the boroughs. And I think you said it's the boroughs in a sense. And I think that's right. That's partly because it is the boroughs who have their own streets and manage their own streets. And the Mayor of London, that is, actually doesn't manage that number of streets. Anyway, I just wanted to point out that really, unless the political administration is prepared to put the money into it, which we did, as you said, at the beginning of the 21st century, then even having a Rupert, I think Rupert would just have gotten frustrated and left, to be honest. So, okay, thanks.
Great, thank you, Rita. Okay, any more?
Paul?
Yeah.
It's John here on the iPad again.
Hi, John.
Hi. Just to add in a little interesting fact to the difference in between boroughs. You're obviously aware of Notting Hill Gate. And all the maples that run down either side of on Notting Hill Gate. Again, in the 90s, that stretch of road and area was basically treeless. There wasn't a single tree anywhere outside those shops, outside the Curzon Cinema, McDonald's, pavement. There was nothing there at all. And Kensington Chelsea had a character there who pushed and pushed to get the borough to plant some trees there. But they kept saying, no, there's no way they can plant trees. There's too many underground services. There's not enough room. But in the end, they came up with the idea that they were going to plant all the trees and then fell them in 10 years. So at least they could green up that area, Notting Hill Gate itself. Fell all the trees and then replant them with new ones to last another 10 years. So they didn't get too big.
Yeah, well, that I think that's something I've heard in other places as well. But I wonder whether, you know, we ought to kind of think more about longevity as well when it comes to planting trees on streets.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Any others? Should I hand back to Graham? Do you want to say some
final words. I'm conscious we probably all want to get out and clap the NHS in 15 minutes or so. So, Graham, anything to?
No. Well, the only thing I'll just add, I forgot to tell you, in case you're interested, that the amazing trees that I saw across the road from the Grapes pub in Limehouse, and of course they're still there, are catalpas, or Indian bean trees, which originate in the deep south of the United States, and in particular, I think from the state of Mississippi. They're not quite out in leaf yet. They're just coming. They're quite late. But it was those kind of discoveries that I think proves that London is a world city, not just in terms of its people and its cultures and its nationalities, but in terms of its arboriculture as well, and quite right too. Thank you all for coming. Thank you.
Okay, well, I'm going to unmute everybody, and so we can all say bye. But thank you all once again for coming. A reminder that the book is for sale, and hopefully Catherine's put the link into the chat, and may do that just one more time with the launch 10 discount code. Also, there is my website as well, and my social media. If anybody's not aware of that, you may well be, but I am at the Street Tree on social media. So I shall unmute you all and just say goodbye, and thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
And hopefully see you in real life.
Bye, Oscar.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
Bye.
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 Està kelas anak. Aku mau mẹ bài xong rồi nó nó story.
Bye.
Bye.